After 3 years of Derek's late nights at Meridian Financial Group, I decided to surprise him with dinner. The security guard at his office building had never heard of him. By midnight, I was standing outside a downtown loft with rose petals scattered on the doorstep, and another woman's laughter echoing through the windows. The spare key Derek thought he'd hidden so cleverly opened the door to a life I never knew existed. 6 months later, he lost everything: his marriage, his job, and his carefully constructed web of lies. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Phoenix summer heat was beginning to fade as October settled over Desert Hills, our quiet subdivision where identical stucco houses lined streets named after precious stones. I'd been working from home for the past 4 years as a freelance graphic designer, building my client base while Derek climbed the corporate ladder at what he claimed was Meridian Financial Group downtown. Our routine had become predictable. He'd leave each morning in his pressed navy suits, kissing me goodbye with promises of another busy day ahead, and return home well past 9 most evenings, exhausted and claiming the commercial real estate market was more demanding than ever. That Tuesday started like any other. Derek's alarm buzzed at 6:30 sharp, the same time it had for the past 3 years. I listened to his shower running, the familiar sounds of him getting ready filtering through our master bathroom door. Coffee was already brewing when he emerged, hair perfectly styled, cologne subtle but expensive. He grabbed his leather briefcase from the kitchen counter where he'd left it the night before. The same worn brown leather case his father had given him when he graduated college. "Another late one tonight, babe," he said, pecking my cheek while scrolling through his phone. "The Henderson project is heating up. Might not be home until after 10. His fingers moved quickly across the screen, typing what I assumed were work emails. The blue light from his device cast shadows across his angular face, highlighting the stress lines that had appeared around his eyes over the past year. I nodded absently, focused on my own laptop screen where a logo design for a local bakery demanded my attention. "I'll save you dinner in the fridge," I replied automatically. It was the same conversation we'd had countless times, the same script we'd been following for months. Derek's work schedule had grown increasingly demanding, or so he claimed. Board meetings ran late, client dinners stretched past midnight, weekend conferences required his presence. I'd stopped questioning it long ago, accepting that building a successful career meant sacrifices. "You're amazing, Rachel," he said, his voice warm with what sounded like genuine affection. "I don't know what I'd do without you understanding how crazy things are right now." He squeezed my shoulder before heading toward the garage. "Love you." The automatic garage door rumbled open and closed, leaving me alone with the quiet hum of our central air conditioning and the distant sound of our neighbor's landscaping crew beginning their weekly maintenance. I returned to my work, losing myself in color palettes and typography choices, the creative process providing the same comfort it always had. Hours passed unnoticed as I refined designs, responded to client emails, and managed the small business I'd built from our spare bedroom turned home office. Around 4 that afternoon, my friend Carmen called. We'd met 2 years ago at a yoga class and bonded over our shared love of hiking and terrible reality television. She worked as a nurse at Phoenix General, her schedule rotating between day and night shifts in ways that often left her free during unconventional hours. "Girl, I'm starving and tired of eating alone," she announced without preamble. "Derek working late again?" There was something in her tone that made me pause, a subtle shift I couldn't quite identify. "When isn't he?" I replied, saving my current project and stretching my neck. "Some big Henderson project has him staying past 10 most nights." Carmen was quiet for a moment. "Rachel, can I ask you something? When's the last time you actually saw Derek's office? Like, visited him at work?" The question caught me off guard. I tried to remember, scrolling back through months of memories. "I don't think I ever have, actually. He always said the building has strict security policies about visitors." "Why?" "No reason," she said quickly. "Just wondering. Listen, why don't you surprise him with dinner tonight? Show up at his office around 7 with takeout from that Italian place he loves. I bet he'd appreciate it after all those late nights." Something in her suggestions sparked an idea that had been dormant for months. When was the last time I'd done something spontaneous for Derek? When had I last surprised him, shown him that I appreciated his hard work? Our marriage had settled into comfortable routine, but maybe that comfort had become complacency. You know what? That's actually a perfect idea, I said, already mentally planning the surprise. He's been so stressed lately. A surprise dinner might be exactly what he needs. After hanging up with Carmen, I felt energized in a way I hadn't experienced in months. I spent the next hour researching Derek's favorite Italian restaurant, planning the perfect surprise. Chicken Parmigiana was his weakness, along with their homemade tiramisu. I'd wear the blue dress he'd complimented last month, the one that brought out my eyes. Maybe we could eat together in his office, or find a quiet spot nearby where we could reconnect over a meal that didn't involve reheated leftovers and the distraction of television. The afternoon flew by as I finished my current project and prepared for the evening ahead. I showered and changed into the blue dress, taking extra time with my makeup and hair. Derek had been working so hard lately, staying focused on building our future together. The least I could do was show him how much I appreciated his dedication. At 6:30, I called Marcello's Italian Kitchen and placed our usual order for pickup. The familiar voice of Maria, the owner's daughter, greeted me warmly. "The usual for you and Derek?" she asked. "Haven't seen you two in a while." "He's been working crazy hours," I explained, grabbing my purse and car keys. "I thought I'd surprise him at his office tonight." "How romantic," Maria said. "He's lucky to have someone so thoughtful." The drive downtown took longer than expected due to rush hour traffic, but I didn't mind. I used the time to plan what I'd say when I showed up at his office. Maybe we could make this a regular thing, me bringing dinner on his late nights. It might help us reconnect, bring back some of the spontaneity that had characterized our early relationship. Meridian Financial Group occupied several floors of a sleek glass tower on Central Avenue, according to the business cards Derek had given me years ago. I'd never paid much attention to the details, trusting that he knew his own workplace. But as I approached the building with warm Italian food filling my car with oregano and garlic scents, I realized I didn't actually know which floor his office was on. The lobby was impressive, all polished marble and modern art installations. A security guard sat behind an imposing desk, his uniform crisp and professional. Evening light filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting geometric patterns across the gleaming floor. "Good evening," I said, approaching his desk with what I hoped was a confident smile. "I'm here to see Derek Porter. I'm his wife, and I thought I'd surprise him with dinner." The security guard looked up from his computer screen, his expression politely attentive. "Derek Porter?" he repeated, his fingers moving across his keyboard. "Can you spell the last name for me?" "Porter," I said, my confidence beginning to waver slightly. "He works for Meridian Financial Group." The guard frowned, his search clearly coming up empty. "I'm not seeing anyone by that name in our directory. Meridian Financial is on floors 12 through 15. Are you sure about the spelling?" A cold sensation began spreading through my chest. "He's been working here for 3 years," I said, my voice sounding strangely distant to my own ears. "Commercial real estate. The Henderson Project?" The guard's expression shifted to something approaching sympathy. "Ma'am, I've been working this building for 5 years. I know most of the Meridian employees, especially the ones who work late regularly. I've never seen anyone matching that description." The lobby suddenly felt too bright, too spacious. The Italian food in my hands seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. "Could you check again? Maybe he's listed under a different department?" The guard obligingly typed for another few moments, but his expression told me what his words confirmed. "I'm sorry, ma'am. There's no Derek Porter employed in this building. Are you sure you have the right location?" I thanked him mechanically and walked back to my car on unsteady legs, my mind struggling to process what I'd just learned. 3 years of late nights, 3 years of believing Derek worked in this building, 3 years of accepting his explanations about demanding clients and crucial projects. All of it based on a lie so fundamental that I couldn't begin to understand its implications. Sitting in my car in the parking garage, I stared at the business card I'd pulled from my wallet. Meridian Financial Group, Derek Porter, commercial real estate specialist. The address matched the building I'd just left, but Derek had never worked there. The card was either fake, or he'd had it made for reasons I couldn't fathom. My hands shook as I started the engine. If Derek wasn't working late at Meridian Financial Group, where had he been spending his evenings for the past 3 years? What was so important that it required elaborate deception, fake business cards, and carefully constructed lies? The drive home passed in a blur of streetlights and stop signs that barely registered in my consciousness. Questions multiplied faster than I could process them. Had Derek ever worked at Meridian? Was there another job he'd never told me about? Was he having an affair? The possibility hit me like ice water, sudden and shocking in its clarity. I pulled into our driveway and sat in the darkness of our garage, the automatic door closing behind me with finality. The Italian food sat cooling in the passenger seat, its aroma now making me nauseous rather than hungry. Everything I thought I knew about my marriage, about my husband's daily life, had been revealed as fiction in the space of a 5-minute conversation with a security guard.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Derek's car wasn't in the garage, of course. He was somewhere else, doing something else, being someone else. The man I'd kissed goodbye that morning, the man who'd claimed to be heading to another demanding day at Meridian Financial Group, had driven away to a destination I knew nothing about. I went inside and placed the untouched dinner in the refrigerator, the normalcy of the action feeling surreal given what I'd discovered. Our house looked exactly the same as it had when I'd left, but everything felt different. The framed photos of Derek and me on various vacations now seemed like evidence of an elaborate performance. His coffee cups still sat in the sink from this morning, a mundane artifact from a life that apparently contained depths of deception I'd never suspected. Carmen called around 9, her voice bright with curiosity. How did the surprise go? Was Derek shocked? I found myself unable to speak for several seconds, the reality of the situation still settling into my consciousness like sediment in disturbed water. Carmen, I finally managed. Derek doesn't work at Meridian Financial Group. He's never worked there. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if we'd been disconnected. When Carmen finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. Rachel, how do you know? I went to surprise him. The security guard had never heard of him. They have no record of anyone named Derek Porter working in that building. I sank into our kitchen chair, the same chair where I'd sat that morning, accepting another lie about another late night. Oh, honey, Carmen said, and something in her tone suggested she wasn't entirely surprised by this revelation. What are you going to do? Before I could answer, I heard the familiar sound of Derek's car pulling into the driveway. He's home, I whispered, panic suddenly flooding my system. Carmen, he's home, and I don't know what to say to him. Don't say anything tonight, she advised quickly. Act normal. You need time to think this through, to figure out what's really going on before you confront him. The garage door rumbled open as I hung up the phone. I quickly moved to the living room and grabbed a book, trying to appear as though I'd been reading peacefully all evening. My heart hammered against my ribs as Derek's footsteps approached from the garage. Hey, babe, he called out, his voice carrying the same tired but affectionate tone it always did after his supposed long days at the office. Sorry I'm so late. The Henderson meeting ran longer than expected. I looked up as he entered the living room, studying his face for signs of deception I'd somehow missed for 3 years. He looked tired, certainly, but not like someone who'd spent 12 hours in corporate meetings. His tie was loosened, but not wrinkled. His shirt showed no signs of conference room marathon sessions. Most tellingly, he didn't have the particular exhaustion that comes from genuine professional stress. How was your day? I managed to ask, my voice sounding almost normal. Derek sank into his favorite armchair and began removing his shoes, a ritual I'd watched thousands of times. Brutal, he said, massaging his temples. But we're making progress on the Henderson project. Should wrap up in the next few weeks. Every word felt like another small knife wound. The casual lies, delivered with such practiced ease, revealed a level of deception that went far beyond simple dishonesty. This was systematic, sustained, elaborate fiction that had shaped our entire marriage. That's good, I replied, turning a page in the book I wasn't actually reading. I saved dinner for you in the fridge. Derek smiled, the same warm smile that had made me fall in love with him 5 years ago. You're the best, Rachel. What would I do without you? The irony of his question wasn't lost on me. What would he do without me believing his lies, accepting his absences, providing the stable home base that allowed him to live whatever secret life he'd constructed? I was apparently essential to maintaining whatever elaborate deception he'd been running for years. We went through our normal evening routine. Derek ate the reheated dinner I'd originally planned as a surprise, telling me about fictional meetings with fictional clients about fictional projects. I half listened, nodding at appropriate moments while my mind raced through possibilities and implications. When we went to bed, Derek fell asleep quickly, his breathing settling into the regular rhythm that indicated deep, untroubled rest. I lay awake beside him, studying his profile in the darkness. Who was this man I'd married? What did he actually do during those 12-hour absences from our house? And perhaps most importantly, what was I going to do with the knowledge that my entire marriage was built on fundamental lies? The questions multiplied as the night wore on, but one thing became increasingly clear. I couldn't continue living in willful ignorance. Whatever Derek was hiding, whatever life he was living apart from our marriage, I needed to know the truth. Not just for the sake of our relationship, but for my own sanity and self-respect. By the time dawn began filtering through our bedroom curtains, I'd made a decision. I was going to find out exactly where Derek spent his days, what he did during those long absences, and who he really was beneath the carefully constructed facade he presented at home. The woman who had accepted his explanations without question was gone, replaced by someone who demanded truth, even when it might destroy everything she thought she knew about her life. The investigation would begin tomorrow, but the marriage I thought I had ended the moment that security guard told me Derek Porter didn't exist in the Meridian Financial Group directory. Everything that followed would simply be the process of documenting the extent of his deception and deciding what to do with the ruins of what I'd believed was a loving, honest partnership. Derek stirred beside me as morning light grew stronger, his arm reaching across the space between us in his sleep. Once, that unconscious gesture would have filled me with warmth and contentment. Now it felt like another lie, another piece of performance in the elaborate theater our marriage had apparently always been. The next morning, Derek's alarm buzzed at exactly 6:30, just as it had every morning for 3 years. But this time, I watched him through different eyes. Every gesture, every word, every casual kiss goodbye carried new weight. He moved through his routine with the same confidence he'd always displayed, checking his phone, adjusting his tie, grabbing the leather briefcase that now seemed like a stage prop. "Big presentation today," he announced, scrolling through messages that I now wondered if they were even work-related. "The Henderson project is really heating up. Might be another 12-hour day." I nodded from behind my coffee cup, studying his face for tells I'd never bothered to look for before. His eyes didn't quite meet mine when he mentioned the Henderson project. His left hand fidgeted with his wedding ring, a gesture I'd always attributed to nervousness about work pressure. Now it seemed like something else entirely. "Drive safe," I said, the same words I'd spoken every morning for years. But they tasted bitter now. After his car disappeared around the corner of Ruby Street, I sat in our kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of our shared life. Wedding photos on the refrigerator, his favorite coffee mug in the sink, the newspaper folded to the business section the way he always left it. Everything looked normal, but nothing felt real anymore. Carmen called at 8, her voice careful and measured. "How are you holding up this morning?" "I don't know," I admitted, staring at Derek's empty chair across from me. "I keep thinking maybe I misunderstood something. Maybe there's an explanation." "Honey, security guards don't make mistakes about who works in their building. Especially not after 5 years on the job." Carmen's words carried the gentle firmness of someone delivering necessary medicine. "What's your plan?" That was the question that had kept me awake all night. What was my plan? Confront Derek directly and demand the truth? Follow him to see where he actually spent his days? Hire someone to investigate? Every option felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. I'm going to follow him tomorrow, I heard myself say, surprising even myself with the decision. I need to see for myself where he goes, what he does. Rachel, are you sure that's safe? What if he's involved in something dangerous? The possibility hadn't fully occurred to me, and it sent a chill through my chest. What if Derek's deception involved more than just infidelity? What if he was engaged in something illegal, something that could put both of us at risk? I'll be careful, I promised, though I had no idea what careful looked like in this situation. I just need to know. That day dragged endlessly. I tried to work on client projects, but every design looked flat and meaningless. I attempted to clean the house, but touching Derek's belongings felt like handling evidence in a crime I didn't yet understand. Finally, I gave up on productivity and spent hours walking through desert hills, trying to process the magnitude of what I'd discovered. Our neighborhood had always felt like a sanctuary. Neat rows of stucco houses with desert landscaping, children riding bikes on wide sidewalks, neighbors who waved from their driveways. But now it felt like a movie set where everyone was playing their assigned roles, and I was the only one who'd forgotten her lines. Mrs. Chen from next door was watering her barrel cacti when I passed her house for the third time. She looked up with concern etched across her weathered features. Rachel, dear, are you feeling all right? You look a bit pale. I forced a smile that felt more like a grimace. Just getting some exercise. Beautiful day for a walk. She nodded, but her eyes remained worried. How's Derek? Haven't seen much of him lately. Working hard, I suppose? The innocent question hit me like a physical blow. Mrs. Chen had lived next door for 6 years. Had watched Derek leave every morning in his business suits, had probably mentioned his dedication to his career in conversations with other neighbors. How many people had unknowingly participated in maintaining Derek's facade? Yes, very hard. I managed. Commercial real estate is demanding. That evening, Derek returned home at his usual time, looking appropriately tired and slightly disheveled. He kissed my cheek with the same casual affection he'd always shown, hung his suit jacket in the closet with practiced precision, and settled into his armchair with a weary sigh. Rough day? I asked, though every word felt like performing in a play I'd never auditioned for. The Henderson deal hit another snag, he said, loosening his tie. Legal complications. We might need to restructure the entire agreement. I nodded as if I understood, as if I cared about fictional legal complications in a fictional deal. Derek launched into details about zoning issues and permit delays, creating an elaborate narrative that would have been impressive if it weren't so devastating. The casual skill with which he constructed these lies suggested years of practice, a depth of deception that made my stomach clench. During dinner, I found myself studying him with new intensity. The way he chewed his food, the rhythm of his breathing, the unconscious gestures I'd watched thousands of times. Was any of it genuine? Had he ever been the man I thought I married, or had that person been a fiction from the very beginning? You're quiet tonight, Derek observed, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. Everything okay? His touch, once comforting, now felt like a stranger's fingers against my skin. Just tired. I lied, adding my own deception to the elaborate web we'd apparently been weaving together for years. The next morning, I implemented my plan with shaking hands and a racing heart. Instead of settling into my home office after Derek left, I grabbed my keys and followed his route toward downtown Phoenix. Staying far enough behind to avoid detection, I watched his silver sedan navigate through morning traffic toward the business district. But instead of turning toward Central Avenue where Meridian Financial Group was located, Derek's car continued east toward Old Town Scottsdale. My confusion mounted as he exited the freeway and wound through residential neighborhoods I'd never seen him visit before. He finally stopped at a luxury apartment complex called Desert Mirage, its modern architecture and manicured landscaping suggesting expensive monthly rent. I parked across the street behind a delivery truck and watched Derek walk confidently toward the building entrance, using what appeared to be a key fob to gain access. The implications crashed over me like ice water. Derek had an apartment. Not just any apartment, but what looked like an expensive one in an upscale complex 30 miles from our house. How long had he been maintaining two residences? How was he paying for it? And most importantly, what was he doing there every day while I believed he was building our future at Meridian Financial Group? I sat in my car for 2 hours, watching the building entrance and trying to process what I'd discovered. Other residents came and went. Young professionals and well-dressed couples who belonged in this affluent complex. Derek fit right in with his business attire and confident stride. This wasn't a seedy motel or a friend's couch. This was a deliberate, expensive, long-term deception. Around noon, Derek emerged from the building. But he wasn't alone. A woman walked beside him, her hand resting comfortably in the crook of his elbow. She was stunning in a way that made my chest tighten with recognition and dread. Tall and elegant with perfectly styled auburn hair, wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than I spent on clothes in 6 months. They moved together with the easy familiarity of an established couple. I watched them drive away in Derek's car, her laughter visible even from across the street as she threw her head back at something he said. The casual intimacy between them spoke of time and comfort, of inside jokes and shared experiences. This wasn't a brief affair or a moment of weakness. This was a relationship, complete and established, running parallel to our marriage. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. 3 years of believing Derek was building our future while he was actually building a completely separate life with another woman. 3 years of accepting his explanations while he maintained an expensive apartment and an elaborate relationship I knew nothing about. I drove home mechanically, muscle memory navigating familiar streets while my mind reeled with implications. Derek wasn't just cheating on me. He was living a double life so complete and sophisticated that it required fake business cards, fictional employers, and carefully constructed schedules to maintain. Back in our house, everything looked exactly as it had that morning, but the space felt contaminated now. Derek's coffee cup in the sink, his newspaper on the counter, his shoes by the front door. All props in a performance I hadn't realized I was watching. I called in sick to my client meetings and spent the afternoon in a strange fugue state, moving through rooms that no longer felt like home. Our wedding photos seemed to mock me from their frames. Had Derek been thinking about her when he smiled at the camera on our honeymoon? Had he been planning his escape even then? The phone rang around 3, startling me from my daze. Carmen's name appeared on the caller ID, and I answered without thinking. "I followed him," I said before she could speak. "Oh honey, what did you find?" "He has an apartment, an expensive one, and there's a woman." My voice sounded flat and distant, as if someone else was speaking the words. "They look like they've been together for years." Carmen was quiet for a long moment. "Rachel, I'm coming over. Don't make any decisions until I get there." "I'm fine," I protested, though nothing could have been further from the truth. "No, you're not. You're in shock." "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Carmen arrived with grocery bags and the determined expression she wore during her most challenging nursing shifts. She found me sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by photo albums I'd pulled from shelves without really knowing why. "Talk to me," she said, settling beside me on the carpet. I told her everything. The luxury apartment complex, the woman with auburn hair, the casual intimacy I'd witnessed between them. With each detail, the reality of my situation became more concrete and more devastating. "How long do you think this has been going on?" Carmen asked gently. "I don't know. Maybe the entire marriage." The words tasted like ash. Maybe I was never anything more than his cover story. Carmen picked up one of the photo albums, flipping through pictures of Derek and me on various vacations. "These look happy," she said carefully. "Maybe it started later." "Does it matter when it started?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "The result is the same. My entire marriage is a lie." That evening, I performed the most difficult acting of my life. When Derek came home at his usual time, I greeted him with what I hoped passed for normalcy. I heated up leftover casserole, asked about his day, and listened to another elaborate fiction about the Henderson Project. The legal team thinks we can resolve the zoning issues by Friday, he said, twirling spaghetti around his fork. Should be smooth sailing after that. I nodded and made appropriate responses while studying his face for any sign of guilt or awareness. But Derek seemed completely comfortable in his deception, as if lying to his wife was as natural as breathing. After dinner, we settled into our evening routine. Derek watched the news while I pretended to read, but my mind was spinning with questions and implications. How was he paying for the apartment? Who was the woman, and how had they met? Did she know he was married? Or was she another victim of his elaborate deceptions? When we went to bed, Derek fell asleep quickly, his breathing settling into the regular rhythm that had once comforted me. I lay awake beside him, feeling like I was sharing a bed with a stranger. Every sound he made, every unconscious movement, reminded me that I didn't know the man lying next to me. Around 3 in the morning, I slipped out of bed and went to Derek's home office. I'd never snooped through his belongings before, respecting his privacy and trusting in our relationship. But trust was a luxury I could no longer afford. His desk drawers yielded nothing immediately suspicious. Business documents for clients I'd never heard of, expense reports for meetings that may or may not have happened, appointment calendars filled with abbreviations and codes that meant nothing to me. But in the bottom drawer, hidden behind a stack of manila folders, I found a credit card statement in Derek's name for an account I'd never seen. The charges painted a clear picture of his secret life. Monthly rent payments to desert mirage apartments, expensive dinners at romantic restaurants I'd never been to, jewelry purchases from boutiques in Scottsdale, charges from lingerie shops and day spas, even vacation rentals in places Derek had claimed to be traveling for business. The statement covered 6 months of expenses, totaling nearly $30,000, money that had to be coming from somewhere, because our joint account certainly couldn't support that level of spending. Which meant Derek had income I knew nothing about, or debt I was unaware of, or both. I photographed every page with my phone, my hands shaking so badly I had to take several attempts to get clear images. The evidence of Derek's betrayal was overwhelming, but I needed to document everything before deciding what to do next. Back in bed, I stared at the ceiling until dawn, my mind racing through possibilities and implications. Derek's deception wasn't just emotional betrayal. It was financial fraud, identity theft, and elaborate criminality that could have legal consequences for both of us. When his alarm buzzed at 6:30, I pretended to be asleep, watching through half-closed eyes as he went through his morning routine. He moved with the same confidence he'd always displayed, checking his phone, adjusting his tie, grabbing his briefcase. But now I knew he was preparing for another day in his secret life, another day of lies and deception. After he left, I called my bank and discovered that Derek had been making large cash withdrawals from our joint account over the past year. Amounts I'd never noticed because I trusted him to manage our shared finances responsibly. The missing money totaled nearly $50,000, systematically stolen from our account to fund his parallel existence. The magnitude of the betrayal was staggering. Derek hadn't just cheated on me emotionally and physically. He'd stolen from me financially, using our shared resources to maintain his relationship with another woman. I wasn't just a deceived wife, I was a victim of fraud, theft, and systematic criminal deception. Sitting in our kitchen with bank statements spread across the table, I realized that my marriage wasn't just over. It had probably never existed in the first place. The man I thought I'd married was a fiction, carefully constructed to provide cover for whatever Derek's real life actually entailed. The woman who had trusted blindly, who had accepted explanations without question, who had believed in the fiction of their partnership, was gone. In her place sat someone harder, clearer, and determined to uncover the full extent of Derek's deceptions before deciding how to respond. But first, I needed help. Professional help from people who understood fraud, deception, and the legal implications of what I'd discovered. The evidence I'd gathered was just the beginning. If Derek could maintain such elaborate lies for years, there were probably depths to his deception I hadn't even imagined yet. By the time I'd made my first call to a private investigator, I'd crossed a line I could never uncross. The marriage was over, but the reckoning was just beginning. The private investigator's office sat in a nondescript strip mall between a nail salon and a tax preparation service. Tony Martinez had been recommended by my attorney, who I'd contacted the morning after discovering Derek's credit card statements. The waiting room smelled like stale coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. But Tony himself inspired confidence with his direct manner and professional demeanor. "Mrs. Porter," he said, gesturing for me to take a seat across from his cluttered desk. "I understand you need help documenting some suspicious activity involving your husband." I handed him the folder I'd prepared, containing photographs of the credit card statements, the fake Meridian Financial Group business card, and a detailed timeline of Derek's supposed work schedule versus his actual whereabouts. My hands only shook slightly as I explained what I'd discovered over the past week. Tony listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied me with experienced eyes. "Mrs. Porter, I have to ask this directly. Are you prepared for what we might find? In my experience, men who construct deceptions this elaborate usually have more secrets than just extramarital affairs." The question sent a chill through me, but I nodded. "I need to know everything. Whatever the cost. My retainer is $5,000. The investigation could take several weeks, depending on how deep this goes." He slid a contract across the desk. "I'll need you to understand that once we start pulling threads, we might unravel more than you expect." I signed the contract with steady hands, though my signature looked foreign to my own eyes. Rachel Porter, the trusting wife who had believed every lie for 3 years, was gone. In her place sat someone harder, someone who demanded truth regardless of consequences. That afternoon I drove to Desert Hills, small downtown area, and found myself wandering into shops I'd never bothered to visit before. A vintage bookstore caught my attention, its narrow aisles packed floor to ceiling with used volumes that smelled like dust and possibility. I hadn't read fiction in years, too busy managing client projects and maintaining the home that Derek apparently saw as merely a convenient base of operations. The elderly woman behind the counter looked up from her crossword puzzle as I browsed aimlessly through the psychology section. "Looking for anything particular, dear?" "Books about starting over," I said without thinking. "About rebuilding your life when everything you thought you knew turns out to be wrong." She studied me with kind eyes that had probably seen many women in similar circumstances. "Relationship troubles?" I nodded, surprised by how easily I could acknowledge the situation to a stranger. "My husband isn't who I thought he was. I'm not sure I am either." "Ah," she said, rising from her stool with practiced ease. "You need the transformation section." She led me to a corner I would never have discovered on my own, filled with memoirs, self-help books, and philosophical texts about personal reinvention. Her weathered fingers traced along various spines before selecting a thin volume bound in faded blue cloth. "This one helped me after my divorce 30 years ago," she said, handing me the book. "Sometimes losing what we thought we wanted is how we find out what we actually need." The title read, "Emerging from the Chrysalis, A Woman's Guide to Personal Revolution." I flipped through pages marked with previous readers, penciled notes in margins, evidence of other women who had found guidance in these words. "Thank you," I said, clutching the book like a lifeline. "How much?" She waved away my money. "Take it. Pass it on to someone else when you're ready." Back home, I settled into the reading nook Derek had always claimed was too small for practical use. The afternoon sun streamed through windows that suddenly seemed brighter without Derek's presence filling the space with tension I hadn't recognized until now. The book spoke about the necessity of destruction before reconstruction, about how identity crises often preceded the discovery of authentic self. I found myself taking notes in margins, adding my thoughts to the conversation previous readers had started with pencil marks and exclamation points. For the first time in months, my mind felt engaged with something beyond client deadlines and household maintenance. Carmen called around 5, her voice careful and measured. "How are you holding up?" "I hired a private investigator," I said, surprised by how normal the word sounded. "And I bought a book about personal transformation." "That sounds healthy. Are you eating?" The question made me realize I hadn't felt hungry all day, though I should have been starving. "Not really. Food doesn't seem important right now." "I'm bringing dinner." No arguments. Carmen arrived an hour later carrying bags from our favorite Thai restaurant, but she didn't head for the kitchen as usual. Instead, she led me to the back patio, where we could sit among the desert landscape Derek had insisted on when we bought the house. "Tell me about this investigator," she said, setting containers of pad thai and green curry between us. I explained Tony Martinez and his warnings about elaborate deceptions hiding deeper secrets. Carmen listened while spooning rice onto our plates, her expression growing more concerned with each detail. "Rachel, what if Derek is involved in something dangerous? What if exposing him puts you at risk?" The possibility had occurred to me, but sitting in the evening air with the scent of desert sage surrounding us, I felt calmer than I had in years. Then I'll deal with that when it happens, but I can't keep living this lie. We ate in comfortable silence, watching the sun set behind the mountains that ringed Phoenix in purple shadows. The beauty of the landscape struck me as if I were seeing it for the first time. How long had I been sleepwalking through my own life? "I think I want to redecorate," I said suddenly. "Change everything. Make this place mine instead of ours." Carmen smiled, the first genuine expression of pleasure I'd seen from her all week. "Now that sounds like the Rachel I remember from before you got married." Her words hit me with unexpected force. There had been a Rachel before Derek, a woman with opinions and preferences and dreams that didn't revolve around supporting someone else's ambitions. She had loved hiking and photography, had talked about traveling to art museums in Europe, had considered going back to school for her master's degree. That night, after Derek came home with another elaborate story about the Henderson Project's legal complications, I retreated to the guest bedroom with my new book and a notebook. Derek seemed puzzled by my early departure but didn't question it, probably relieved to have time for whatever phone calls or messages his secret life required. I started making lists, things I had enjoyed before marriage, goals I had abandoned to support Derek's supposed career, interests I had set aside to maintain our household. The pages filled quickly with handwriting that looked foreign after years of typing everything on keyboards. Photography had been my passion in college. I'd won awards for portrait work and had dreamed of opening a studio specializing in family photography. Derek had discouraged the idea, claiming the market was oversaturated and the income too unpredictable. Instead, I'd channeled my visual skills into graphic design, safer but less fulfilling. Travel writing had been another dream, combining my love of photography with storytelling about cultures and landscapes. Derek had supported the concept in theory, but found reasons why every trip I proposed was impractical or expensive. We'd taken vacations, but always to places Derek chose for reasons that seemed logical at the time. Graduate school had been a recurring fantasy, earning my Master of Fine Arts and teaching at the community college level. Derek had been supportive during our engagement but raised concerns about time commitments and student loan debt after we married. The applications I'd started remained unfinished in a file cabinet drawer. Each abandoned dream represented a piece of myself I'd surrendered to maintain harmony in a marriage that had been built on systematic deception. The woman who had made those compromises felt like a stranger now, someone whose priorities and judgment I couldn't understand. The next morning brought a call from Tony Martinez. "Mrs. Porter, I have preliminary findings you need to see. Can you come to my office this afternoon?" His tone suggested significant developments, and I agreed to meet at 2 o'clock. The morning dragged endlessly as I tried to focus on client work, but my concentration was scattered. Finally, I gave up and drove to the office early, stopping at a coffee shop to kill time and gather courage for whatever Tony had discovered. His expression when I arrived told me the news wasn't good. He gestured for me to sit and opened a thick folder on his desk. "Mrs. Porter, your husband's situation is more complicated than a simple affair. Derek Porter doesn't exist as a legal entity in several important databases. No credit history before 5 years ago, no employment records prior to your marriage, no educational transcripts from any of the schools he claims to have attended." The words seemed to come from a great distance. "What does that mean?" "It means Derek Porter is likely an assumed identity. The man you married is someone else entirely, someone with a past he's worked hard to erase." Tony's voice was gentle but firm. "The apartment in Desert Mirage is leased under the name David Preston. Same physical description, same vehicle registration, but different social security number." My hands began to shake as the implications settled over me like ice water. Are you saying I'm not legally married? That depends on what name he used on your marriage certificate, and whether that represents his legal identity. But Mrs. Porter, there's more. David Preston has an extensive criminal history in Nevada. Fraud, identity theft, embezzlement. He served 18 months in state prison and was released 4 years ago. The coffee shop noise around us faded to white static. My husband was not only living a double life, he was living under a false identity. I had married a stranger, a criminal, a man whose real name I didn't even know. The woman he's been seen with is named Lisa Garrett. She works as a marketing director for a pharmaceutical company in Scottsdale. According to public records, she's been dating David Preston for 2 years. As far as I can determine, she has no knowledge of his marriage to you. 2 victims, then. Lisa Garrett deceived about her boyfriend's marital status, and me, deceived about everything. The scope of Derek's deception was staggering in its complexity and cruelty. What should I do? I asked, though my voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. That depends on what outcome you want. We can turn this information over to law enforcement, since identity fraud is a federal crime. We can gather evidence for divorce proceedings, though that might be complicated given questions about the marriage's legal validity. Or you can simply disappear from his life the way he'll probably disappear from yours, once he realizes he's been exposed. I stared at the folder containing evidence of my husband's criminal deception, trying to process decisions that would reshape my entire future. The woman who had trusted blindly would have been paralyzed by such choices. But the woman I was becoming felt surprisingly clear about what needed to happen next. I want to gather more evidence first, I said. I need to understand exactly who I'm dealing with before I decide how to proceed. Tony nodded approvingly. Smart approach. But Mrs. Porter, I strongly recommend you don't confront him until we have complete documentation. Men with his background can become dangerous when cornered. That evening, I performed the most difficult acting of my life. When Derek came home with another fictional tale about the Henderson Project, I listened with appropriate interest while studying his face for traces of David Preston, the ex-convict who had stolen my husband's identity. His features looked the same, but knowing the truth made every expression seem like a carefully constructed mask. You seem distracted tonight, Derek observed during dinner. Everything okay? Just tired. I lied, adding my own small deception to the enormous web he'd been weaving for years. Busy day with client deadlines. He reached across the table to squeeze my hand, a gesture that once would have comforted me but now felt like contamination. You work too hard, babe. Maybe we should plan a vacation when this Henderson deal wraps up. The casual cruelty of his concern was breathtaking. Here was a man who had married me under false pretenses, stolen my money to fund his relationship with another woman, and constructed an elaborate criminal deception that could destroy both our lives. Yet he could still play the caring husband with convincing sincerity. That night, I lay awake listening to Derek's steady breathing and wondering who was really sleeping beside me. David Preston, the ex-convict? Someone else entirely? How many identities had he assumed? How many women had he deceived? How many crimes had he committed that I knew nothing about? The next morning brought another breakthrough. Tony called while Derek was in the shower, his voice urgent and excited. Mrs. Porter, I found something significant. David Preston owns property in Nevada under his real name, purchased with cash 6 months ago. A small ranch outside Las Vegas, completely off the grid. I think we might have found his exit strategy. Exit strategy? Men like this always have escape plans. When their current identity becomes too risky, they disappear and start over somewhere else. The Nevada property suggests he's preparing to abandon the Derek Porter persona. The revelation hit me with unexpected relief rather than fear. Derek was planning to leave anyway. My discovery of his deception had simply accelerated a timeline he'd already established. I wasn't losing a husband so much as discovering I'd never had one to begin with. There's something else, Tony continued. Lisa Garrett filed a missing person report 2 days ago. David Preston hasn't been to the apartment in 72 hours. My blood turned to ice. Derek had been coming home every night. maintaining his normal schedule, giving no indication anything had changed. If David Preston was missing, where was Derek spending his days? "Mrs. Porter, I think your husband might be implementing his exit strategy right now. You could be in danger." I looked toward the bathroom where shower water still ran, Derek's voice audible as he sang an old classic rock song with the casual contentment of a man without worries. Either Tony was wrong about the timeline, or Derek was an even better actor than I'd realized. What should I do? Pack a bag and leave the house. Go somewhere he can't find you while we figure out his next move. And Mrs. Porter, don't tell him you're leaving, just go. The shower shut off as Tony's words settled over me. Derek would emerge from the bathroom in 5 minutes, ready to perform another day of his Derek Porter routine. But now I knew that routine might be ending, and I had no idea what David Preston would do to protect his secrets when he realized his carefully constructed world was collapsing. I hung up the phone and looked around the kitchen that had been the center of my domestic life for 3 years. The coffee pot Derek used every morning, the refrigerator covered with photos of our supposedly happy marriage, the breakfast table where we'd shared thousands of conversations built on lies. Carmen had been right about one thing. I needed to get out of this house, away from this life, before Derek realized how much I'd discovered. The woman who had trusted blindly might have tried to confront him, to demand explanations and attempt reconciliation. But the woman I was becoming understood that some situations required action, rather than discussion, strategy rather than emotion. Derek Porter was disappearing, taking my marriage and my sense of reality with him. The only question was whether I would let David Preston destroy me in the process. From upstairs came the sound of Derek's hairdryer, the same morning routine he'd performed every day for 3 years. But now I knew it might be one of the last times I'd hear those familiar sounds. By this time tomorrow, I could be free from the elaborate fiction our marriage had always been. The realization should have terrified me. Instead, for the first time in months, I felt something that might have been hope. Within 20 minutes of Tony's warning, I had packed a suitcase with essentials and transferred funds from our joint account to my personal savings. The sound of Derek's morning routine continued upstairs while I moved through our house with mechanical precision, gathering documents, medications, and anything else I might need for an extended absence. My hands trembled as I retrieved our marriage certificate from the filing cabinet in Derek's office. The name on the document read Derek Michael Porter, signed in the same confident handwriting I'd seen on birthday cards and grocery lists for 3 years. But now I knew this signature belonged to David Preston, ex-convict, identity thief, and master manipulator. I photographed every important document I could find before Derek finished his shower. Bank statements, insurance policies, tax returns, even the deed to our house. If Derek was planning to disappear, I needed proof of our financial entanglement before he could liquidate assets or transfer ownership to accounts I knew nothing about. The hairdryer shut off upstairs just as I zipped my suitcase closed. Derek would be downstairs in 10 minutes, ready to perform another day of his elaborate charade. But this time I wouldn't be here to provide his audience. I slipped out through the garage and drove directly to Carmen's apartment complex across town. She opened her door wearing scrubs, clearly preparing for her hospital shift, but her expression shifted to alarm when she saw my suitcase. "What's happening?" "Derek isn't Derek," I said, the words sounding surreal even as I spoke them. "His real name is David Preston, and he's an ex-convict. The private investigator thinks he's about to disappear, and I might be in danger." Carmen pulled me inside without hesitation, locking multiple deadbolts behind us. Her apartment felt like a sanctuary after the toxic atmosphere of the house I'd been sharing with a stranger. "Tell me everything," she said, settling me on her couch with a cup of tea that appeared as if by magic. I explained Tony's discoveries while Carmen listened with the focused attention she brought to medical emergencies. Her expression grew grimmer with each revelation, particularly when I described Derek's criminal history and the missing person report Lisa Garrett had filed. "You did the right thing by leaving," she said when I finished. "But Rachel, this is bigger than divorce or infidelity. If he's been using a false identity to commit financial fraud, you could be considered an accomplice unless you distance yourself immediately." The legal implications hadn't fully occurred to me, but Carmen's nursing background included enough emergency room experience with domestic violence and criminal cases to understand the complexities I was facing. What should I do? First, You call Tony Martinez and tell him where you are. Then you document everything before Derek realizes you're gone and starts covering his tracks. She grabbed a notepad from her kitchen counter. Write down every lie you can remember, every inconsistency, every red flag you ignored. Create a timeline of his deception. The exercise proved more devastating than I'd expected. 3 years of marriage contained thousands of small lies, casual deceptions, and manufactured explanations. Derek's fictional employer, his non-existent business trips, his imaginary colleagues and clients. Even his supposed college friends and family members. People I'd never met but had heard about in elaborate stories that were apparently complete fabrications. By noon, I had filled 12 pages with handwritten notes, documenting Derek's systematic deception. The scope was breathtaking in its complexity and cruelty. This wasn't a man who had gradually fallen into dishonesty. This was someone who had constructed an entirely fictional identity for the specific purpose of exploiting my trust and resources. Tony Martinez arrived at Carmen's apartment an hour later, bringing coffee and grim news. "Mrs. Porter, Derek left your house this morning and hasn't returned to the Desert Mirage apartment. His car was spotted at Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport around 11, but we don't know if he boarded a flight or if that was misdirection." My chest tightened with a mixture of relief and anxiety. If Derek had fled, I was safe from immediate confrontation. But his disappearance also meant I might never get answers to the questions that had consumed me for days. What about Lisa Garrett? Still no contact. The Scottsdale police are treating it as a voluntary missing person case, but they're not investigating aggressively, since she's an adult with no history of mental illness or domestic violence. I thought about Lisa, another woman who had trusted David Preston's lies, who was probably sitting in her own home wondering where her boyfriend had gone and why he wasn't returning her calls. She deserved to know the truth, even if it shattered her world the way mine had been destroyed. "I want to talk to her," I said suddenly. Both Tony and Carmen looked at me with concern. "Mrs. Porter, that could be dangerous," Tony warned. "If she's emotionally unstable or blames you for his disappearance, the confrontation could go badly. She's not the enemy here. She's another victim." I pulled out my phone and began searching for Lisa Garrett's contact information. If Derek is gone, she deserves to know who she was really dating. Carmen placed a gentle hand on my arm. "Rachel, are you sure you're ready for that conversation? What if she doesn't believe you? What if she thinks you're the other woman?" The possibility hadn't occurred to me, but it made perfect sense. From Lisa's perspective, I would be the surprise wife of her boyfriend of 2 years. She might see me as the intruder in their relationship, rather than a fellow victim of Derek's elaborate deception. But sitting in Carmen's living room surrounded by evidence of my husband's criminal fraud, I felt a clarity that had been missing from my life for years. Lisa Garrett deserved the truth, regardless of how difficult that conversation might be. "I'm calling her," I decided, dialing the number Tony had provided. The phone rang 4 times before a woman's voice answered, tight with anxiety and hope. "David? Thank God, where have you been?" "This isn't David," I said gently. "My name is Rachel Porter. I think we need to talk about the man you know as David Preston." The silence stretched so long I thought she might have hung up. Finally, her voice returned, smaller and more uncertain. "Who is this? How did you get this number?" "I'm David's wife. We've been married for 3 years, and I just discovered he's been living a double life. I know this is shocking, but I think you're in danger, and you need to know the truth." Another long pause, filled with the sound of Lisa's shaky breathing. "Wife? That's impossible. David isn't married. We've been together for 2 years. We were talking about moving in together." My heart broke for her, remembering my own disbelief when the security guard at Meridian Financial Group had no record of Derek's employment. "Lisa, can we meet somewhere public? I have documents, photographs, evidence that will explain everything, but not over the phone." "This is insane," she whispered, but I could hear the doubt creeping into her voice. David wouldn't lie to me about something that big. 2 hours ago, I would have said the same thing, I replied. But David Preston isn't even his real name. The man we both trusted is a convicted criminal who's been deceiving us both. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop in neutral territory, a busy Starbucks in Central Phoenix, where we could talk without risk of Derek appearing unexpectedly. I spent the drive there rehearsing what I would say, how I would present evidence that would shatter another woman's reality the way mine had been destroyed. Lisa was already seated at a corner table when I arrived, her auburn hair perfectly styled, despite the emotional turmoil she must have been experiencing. She was even more beautiful in person than she'd appeared from across the street at Desert Mirage, with delicate features and expensive clothes that suggested professional success. "Rachel?" she asked as I approached, her voice tentative and scared. I nodded and sat across from her, placing the folder of evidence on the table between us. "Thank you for meeting me. I know this must be terrifying." Up close, Lisa looked exhausted and confused, the way I'd probably looked during my first days of discovery. Her hands shook slightly as she reached for her coffee cup, and her eyes were red-rimmed from crying. "Show me," she said simply. I opened the folder and began with our marriage certificate, watching Lisa's face as she processed the official documentation of Derek's legal commitment to another woman. Her expression shifted from denial to shock to a kind of hollow recognition. "July 15th, 3 years ago," she read aloud. "David was with me that weekend. We went to Sedona for my birthday. He said he had to cut it short for a work emergency, but he was back by Sunday night. The timing made my stomach clench. Derek had married me on Saturday and returned to his girlfriend the next day, maintaining both relationships without missing a beat. I showed her Tony's photographs of Derek entering and leaving our shared home, the credit card statements documenting his theft from our joint account, and finally, the criminal background report revealing David Preston's true identity and prison record. With each document, Lisa grew paler and more silent. When I finished, she stared at the evidence spread across our table, as if trying to solve a puzzle that had too many missing pieces. 18 months in prison for fraud and identity theft, she read from the background report. Released 4 years ago. She looked up at me with eyes full of pain and recognition. He told me he'd been traveling, working overseas projects that were classified. Said that's why there were gaps in his employment history. What does he do for work, as far as you know? Investment consulting. High-end clients who value discretion. Lisa's laugh was bitter and hollow. I should have known it was too good to be true. He always had money, but never talked about specific deals or clients. We sat in silence for several minutes, two women processing the magnitude of deception we'd both experienced. Finally, Lisa spoke again, her voice stronger than before. "How long have you known?" "About the fake job, a week. About his real identity, 2 days. About you." I paused, remembering the pain of watching them together outside the apartment complex. "I followed him last week and saw you together." Lisa's eyes filled with tears. "I called in sick to work Monday because I was so worried about him. He'd been acting strange lately. Distant. I thought maybe he was planning to propose." She wiped her eyes with a napkin. "God, I feel so stupid." "We both trusted someone who made lying look effortless," I said. "That doesn't make us stupid. It makes us human." Over the next hour, Lisa and I compared notes about Derek's behavior, his stories, his explanations for various absences and inconsistencies. The picture that emerged was of a man who had maintained 2 completely separate identities with meticulous precision, never allowing his fictional worlds to overlap or conflict. "The scary part is how good he was at it," Lisa said. "I never suspected anything. Even now, looking at all this evidence, part of me wants to believe there's some explanation." I understood that feeling completely. Even knowing Derek was a criminal, using a false identity, some portion of my mind still wanted to make excuses for him, to find ways his behavior could be justified or explained. "Lisa, there's something else you need to know," I said, pulling out Tony's report about the Nevada property. "The investigator thinks Derek was planning to disappear anyway. He owns property in Nevada under his real name, purchased with cash 6 months ago." Her face crumpled as the final piece fell into place. He was going to leave me. He was going to leave both of us. This wasn't about choosing between relationships. This was about escaping before his deception caught up with him. We exchanged phone numbers and promised to stay in contact as we navigated the legal and emotional aftermath of Derek's disappearance. Lisa mentioned filing a police report about his fraudulent identity, while I planned to consult with attorneys about annulment proceedings and financial recovery. Walking to my car, I felt lighter than I had in days. Lisa Garrett wasn't my enemy or competition. She was an ally, another survivor of Derek's elaborate con game. Together, we had more evidence and credibility than either of us possessed alone. That evening, back at Carmen's apartment, I called my parents for the first time since discovering Derek's deception. The conversation was painful but necessary, explaining why their daughter's marriage was ending and why they might be contacted by investigators or attorneys in the coming weeks. "Honey, I'm so sorry," my mother said, her voice thick with sympathy and concern. "Do you want to come stay with us while you figure this out?" The offer was tempting, but I needed to handle this situation independently. The woman who had trusted Derek's lies might have run home to her parents for protection. But the woman I was becoming understood that growth required facing difficult situations with courage, rather than retreating to familiar comfort. "Thank you, but I need to see this through myself," I said. "I'll be careful, and I'll keep you updated." My father's voice came on the line, gruff with protective anger. "Rachel, if this man stole money from your joint account, that's a federal crime. Don't let him get away with it because you feel sorry for him." His words crystallized something I'd been avoiding. Derek hadn't just broken my heart or betrayed my trust. He had committed multiple felonies that could have serious legal consequences. The woman who had loved him wanted to protect him from those consequences. But the woman I was becoming understood that enabling his behavior would only ensure he victimized others. Over the next 3 days, I worked with Tony Martinez to compile comprehensive evidence of Derek's crimes. Bank records showing unauthorized transfers from our joint account. Documentation of his false identity and criminal history. Photographs and witness statements proving his systematic deception. The process was emotionally exhausting, but also oddly empowering. For 3 years, I'd been a passive participant in Derek's elaborate fiction. Now I was actively gathering evidence to hold him accountable for his actions. Carmen supported me through the process with practical help and emotional stability. She arranged for time off from her nursing shifts to accompany me to attorney meetings. She helped me research legal options and financial recovery strategies. Most importantly, she reminded me daily that I was strong enough to handle whatever came next. "You're different," she observed on Thursday evening as we prepared dinner together. "Stronger. More focused." She was right. The woman who had married Derek Porter was gone, replaced by someone who demanded truth and accountability. The transformation wasn't complete, but it was undeniable and irreversible. That night, I received a call from Tony Martinez, with news I'd been both hoping for and dreading. "Mrs. Porter, Derek Porter has been located. Phoenix police arrested him this morning at a bus station in Flagstaff. He was carrying false identification and a significant amount of cash, attempting to flee to Nevada." My hands began shaking as the implications settled over me. Derek was in custody, which meant I was safe from immediate danger. But it also meant the legal proceedings were about to begin, and I would need to testify about the extent of his deception. What happens now? Federal prosecutors will likely file charges for identity fraud, wire fraud, and theft. You'll need to give a formal statement about his deception and the financial crimes. And, Mrs. Porter, you should prepare yourself for media attention. Cases like this sometimes attract reporters. The possibility of public scrutiny hadn't occurred to me, but it made sense. A man using a false identity to marry and defraud multiple women would be newsworthy, especially if it involved sophisticated long-term deception. But as I hung up the phone and absorbed the news of Derek's arrest, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks. Relief. Not just physical safety, but emotional clarity. The man who had stolen 3 years of my life was finally being held accountable for his actions. The woman who had trusted blindly was gone forever. In her place stood someone who understood that love without honesty was worthless, that trust without verification was dangerous, and that rebuilding her life would require courage she was only beginning to discover. Derek's arrest was just the beginning. The real work of healing and reconstruction still lay ahead. But for the first time since I'd heard that security guard say Derek Porter didn't exist, I felt ready for whatever came next. The federal courthouse in downtown Phoenix buzzed with activity as I walked through security screening on a crisp January morning, 6 months after Derek's arrest. My attorney, Sarah Chen, met me in the marble-lined lobby, her expression professionally calm, but her eyes reflecting the gravity of what was about to happen. "The plea hearing is scheduled for 10 o'clock, she said, guiding me toward the elevator bank. "Derek's attorney contacted me this morning. He wants to speak with you before the proceeding." My stomach tightened at the prospect of seeing Derek again after months of legal preparation and emotional recovery. The last time I'd been in the same room with him, I'd still believed he was my husband working late to build our future together. Today, I knew him as David Preston, federal defendant facing multiple felony charges for identity theft, wire fraud, and financial crimes. What does he want to say? Probably to apologize and ask for leniency in your victim impact statement. Standard procedure when defendants realize the weight of evidence against them. Sarah's voice carried the weariness of someone who had seen too many similar cases. "You don't have to speak with him if you're not ready." The elevator carried us to the 15th floor in silence. Through the windows, Phoenix stretched endlessly toward mountains that shimmered in the desert heat. 6 months ago, I'd been living in that landscape without knowing my entire life was built on lies. Now I was about to face the man who had constructed those lies with meticulous precision. The victim services coordinator led me to a small conference room where Derek sat with his attorney, wearing an Orange County jail jumpsuit that made his skin look sallow and aged. His hair had grown longer and unkempt during his incarceration, and he'd lost weight in ways that emphasized the sharp angles of his face. When I entered, he looked up with eyes that seemed genuinely remorseful, though I'd learned not to trust any expression Derek could manufacture on command. "Rachel," he said, his voice softer than I remembered, "thank you for agreeing to see me." I sat across from him at the conference table, surprised by how little I felt. No anger, no sadness, no residual love or longing. Just a kind of detached curiosity about what the man who had stolen 3 years of my life might want to say in his final moments of freedom. "I wanted to apologize," Derek continued, his hands folded on the table between us. "I know that doesn't undo the harm I caused, but you deserve to hear me say it. I'm sorry for everything I put you through." His attorney, a tired-looking public defender named Michael Ross, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "My client is prepared to make full restitution for the financial damages, Mrs. Porter. The plea agreement includes repayment of all funds stolen from your accounts." I studied Derek's face, looking for signs of the manipulation I'd become expert at recognizing. But he seemed genuinely broken, diminished in ways that went beyond physical appearance. "Why?" I asked simply. "Why did you choose me? Why did you marry me when you were already living with Lisa?" Derek's composure cracked slightly, and for the first time in our conversation, I saw something that might have been authentic emotion. "Because you were kind," he said quietly. "You trusted people without demanding proof. You believed in love without requiring verification. And I—" He paused, struggling with words. "I needed that. Someone who wouldn't ask too many questions." The honesty was devastating in its casual cruelty. He had targeted me specifically for my trusting nature, identified it as a weakness he could exploit for financial gain and emotional cover. "Did you ever love me?" The question surprised me by emerging without conscious intention. Derek was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. "I don't think I know what love means, Rachel. I know I enjoyed being with you. I know you made me feel like I could be better than I was. But I don't think I'm capable of love the way normal people experience it." His admission carried the weight of psychological assessment reports I'd read during the legal proceedings. Derek had been diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder and narcissistic tendencies that made genuine emotional connection nearly impossible. The man I'd married existed primarily as a performance designed to achieve specific goals. What about Lisa? Same thing, different benefits. She had professional connections I needed, social status that opened doors. You had financial resources and family stability. Derek's clinical assessment of his relationships was chilling in its detachment. "I never meant to hurt either of you. I just needed what you could provide." Sarah Chen placed a gentle hand on my arm, sensing my emotional state better than I could assess it myself. "Mrs. Porter, you don't have to continue this conversation if it's too difficult. But I found I wanted to understand, needed to comprehend the psychology behind such elaborate deception. How long were you planning to disappear?" Quote, "From the beginning," Derek admitted, "David Preston was always temporary, just like Derek Porter. I had exit strategies in place from the first month we were married. The revelation should have crushed me, but instead it provided a strange kind of relief." Derek's betrayal wasn't personal in the way I'd imagined. I hadn't failed as a wife or partner. I had simply been selected as a resource to be exploited by someone incapable of genuine human connection. The Nevada property? My retirement plan, cash purchase under my real name, completely off the grid. I was going to disappear in another year or two, once I'd maximized what I could extract from both relationships. His matter-of-fact discussion of our marriages as extraction opportunities was breathtaking in its coldness. Yet hearing it stated so plainly helped me understand that nothing I could have done differently would have changed the outcome. Derek's deception wasn't reactive or emotional. It was strategic and predetermined. The conference room fell silent as we processed the implications of his admissions. Finally, his attorney cleared his throat and addressed the practical matters at hand. "Mrs. Porter, my client is pleading guilty to all charges in exchange for a recommended sentence of 8 to 12 years in federal prison. He'll serve at least 85% of whatever sentence is imposed. The restitution amount is $137,000, covering all documented financial losses plus interest and penalties." The money seemed irrelevant compared to the psychological damage, but I nodded acceptance. Derek would face consequences for his crimes, and I would recover financially even if the emotional healing would take much longer. "Is there anything else you want to say?" I asked Derek directly. He looked up from his hands, and for a brief moment I saw something that might have been genuine regret. "You deserved better than what I gave you, Rachel. You deserved honesty and respect and real partnership. I'm sorry I wasn't capable of providing those things." As apologies went, it was probably the most authentic thing Derek had ever said to me. Not because it changed anything, but because it acknowledged the fundamental incompatibility between who I was and who he was. I had needed truth and connection. He had needed targets and resources. Walking out of the conference room, I felt lighter than I had in months. The man I'd married was going to prison, but the woman I'd been married to was finally free to become whoever she chose to be next. The plea hearing itself was anticlimactic. Derek entered guilty pleas to 14 federal charges while I sat in the gallery with Lisa Garrett, who had become an unlikely friend through our shared experience of Derek's deception. Judge Patricia Williams accepted the pleas and scheduled sentencing for the following month, warning Derek that the court took identity theft and financial fraud very seriously. Outside the courthouse, Lisa and I stood in the January sunshine that felt surprisingly warm after the artificially cooled interior. She had testified earlier about Derek's deception in their relationship, providing evidence that helped establish the pattern of systematic fraud prosecutors needed for enhanced charges. "How do you feel?" she asked, studying my face for signs of emotional distress she'd learned to recognize during our months of mutual support. "Free," I said, surprised by the truth of it. "For the first time in years, I feel completely free." We drove to a small cafe near downtown, where we'd been meeting regularly since Derek's arrest. Our friendship had developed out of necessity but had grown into something genuine and supportive. Lisa understood the specific trauma of loving someone who had never existed, of mourning the loss of a relationship that had been entirely fictional. Over coffee and pastries, we discussed the practical implications of Derek's sentencing. The restitution payments would be managed through the federal court system, with funds transferred from the Nevada property sale and other assets Derek had accumulated through various fraudulent schemes. "Have you decided what you're going to do with the money?" Lisa asked. I'd been considering that question for weeks. The restitution would cover my immediate financial losses, but it couldn't restore the years I'd spent living a lie, or the emotional damage from discovering my entire marriage had been a criminal enterprise. "I'm thinking about going back to school," I said, "finishing that MFA I always talked about, maybe teaching photography at the community college level." Lisa smiled, the first genuinely happy expression I'd seen from her since we'd met. "That sounds perfect for you. You should do things that make you feel alive again." She was right. The woman who had married Derek Porter had abandoned her dreams to support someone else's supposed ambitions. The woman I was becoming understood that authentic fulfillment required pursuing goals that reflected my actual values and interests, rather than compromising them for someone else's approval. Over the following months, I began implementing changes I'd been contemplating since Derek's arrest. I sold the house in Desert Hills, unable to live comfortably in spaces where I'd been unknowingly sharing my life with a criminal. The proceeds, combined with the restitution payments, provided enough financial stability to pursue graduate school without debt or stress. Carmen helped me find a small apartment near Arizona State University's Tempe campus, a bright space with huge windows and enough room for a photography studio. For the first time since college, I was living somewhere that reflected my own aesthetic choices rather than compromising with someone else's preferences. The MFA program accepted me for fall admission based on a portfolio I assembled from photographs I'd been taking during my recovery process. Images of desert landscapes, architectural details, portraits of Lisa and Carmen and other women who had supported me through the darkest period of my life. The work was honest and emotional in ways my earlier photography had never been. Derek's sentencing hearing in March brought closure to the legal proceedings. Judge Williams imposed a sentence of 10 years in federal prison, citing the sophistication of his deception and the number of victims involved. Lisa and I both provided impact statements, describing how Derek's crimes had affected our lives and our ability to trust future relationships. Standing at the podium in the federal courtroom, I looked directly at Derek as I spoke about the psychological damage caused by loving someone who had never existed. He listened without expression, his face a mask I'd learned not to try interpreting. The defendant stole more than money from his victims. I concluded, he stole our sense of reality, our ability to trust our own judgment, our belief that love and commitment have meaning. Those are losses that can't be calculated in dollars or recovered through restitution payments. Judge Williams nodded approvingly as I returned to my seat. When she announced Derek's sentence, I felt something settle inside me that had been agitated for almost a year. Justice wasn't perfect, but it was sufficient. Derek would face consequences for his choices, and I would be free to build a life based on truth rather than fiction. After the hearing, Derek's attorney approached me in the courthouse hallway. "Mrs. Porter, my client asked me to give you this." He handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in Derek's familiar handwriting. I accepted it, but didn't open it until I was alone in my apartment that evening. The letter was brief and handwritten, the first personal communication from Derek since our conversation before his plea hearing. "Rachel, I know you don't owe me anything, least of all forgiveness, but I want you to know that the moments of happiness we shared were real for me, even if everything else was calculated and false. You gave me glimpses of what it might feel like to be a better person, even though I wasn't strong enough to become one. I hope you find the authentic love and partnership you deserve, with someone capable of appreciating your kindness without exploiting it. I'm sorry for everything. David." Reading the letter, I felt a complex mixture of sadness and relief. Derek's final communication wasn't an attempt at manipulation or reconciliation. It was simply an acknowledgement of what we'd both lost when he chose deception over honesty, exploitation over connection. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a box with other documents from my marriage and divorce. Not because I wanted to preserve memories, but because I needed evidence of how far I'd traveled from the woman who had trusted blindly to the woman who demanded truth even when it was painful. Graduate school began in August with photography courses that challenged me to explore themes of identity, authenticity, and reconstruction. My thesis project focused on portraits of women who had survived various forms of betrayal and deception, capturing the strength that emerged from experiences that could have destroyed them. Lisa became one of my subjects, her face reflecting the particular resilience of someone who had learned to trust again after being systematically deceived. Carmen appeared in several portraits, representing the loyal friendship that had sustained me through the darkest period of my life. Other women came forward when word spread about my project, each carrying her own story of survival and renewal. The work was emotionally demanding but deeply satisfying, combining artistic expression with psychological healing in ways that felt both authentic and meaningful. For the first time in years, I was creating something that reflected my own vision, rather than adapting my skills to serve someone else's purposes. By the time Derek had been in federal prison for a year, I rarely thought about him, except when friends asked about my marriage, or when I needed to explain my changed circumstances to new acquaintances. The intense pain of betrayal had settled into something more manageable, a scar rather than an open wound. Lisa and I maintained our friendship, though we both began dating again as our healing progressed. The men we chose were different from Derek in obvious ways, but more importantly, we had become different women than the ones who had been vulnerable to his particular form of manipulation. I was more careful now about trust, requiring consistency between words and actions before accepting anyone's claims about themselves. But I wasn't cynical or closed off. I'd learned to distinguish between healthy skepticism and the kind of blind faith that had made me Derek's ideal target. The photography studio I established in my apartment became a gathering place for women working through various forms of recovery. Not a formal support group, but an informal community of people who understood that healing required both solitude and connection, both honesty about damage and hope for renewal. 2 years after Derek's sentencing, I received a letter from the federal prison where he was serving his sentence. The return address surprised me, as I'd assumed our communication was permanently finished. The letter was brief and written in the same careful handwriting I remembered from birthday cards and grocery lists. Rachel, I don't expect you to respond to this letter, and I understand if reading it is unwelcome. I'm writing because I wanted you to know that I'm getting help here, working with counselors who are helping me understand why I made the choices I did. It doesn't excuse anything, but it's helping me become someone who might not hurt people in the future. I think about the kindness you showed me, even when I didn't deserve it, and I'm grateful that someone like you exists in the world. I hope you're finding happiness and peace. David. I read the letter twice, then set it aside for several days before deciding how to respond. Finally, I wrote a brief reply acknowledging his efforts at self-improvement, while making clear that I felt no obligation to forgive or maintain contact with him. David, I'm glad you're getting help and working to understand your actions. That's important for any future relationships you might have. I've found peace and happiness in my new life, and I wish you success in becoming someone who can contribute positively to the world. Rachel. I mailed the letter the next day and felt the last emotional connection to Derek Porter and David Preston finally dissolve. He was now simply someone from my past, no different from college roommates or former colleagues who had played temporary roles in my life story. The MFA program concluded with a thesis exhibition featuring my portraits of women in recovery. The opening night drew an unexpectedly large crowd, including several couples who had survived various forms of relationship betrayal and were rebuilding their lives together. Standing in the gallery surrounded by images that captured both damage and resilience, I felt a profound sense of completion. The woman who had married Derek Porter was gone forever, but the woman who had emerged from that experience was stronger, clearer, and more authentic than anyone I'd been before. Carmen approached with a glass of wine and her characteristic warm smile. "You look happy," she observed. "Really, genuinely happy." She was right. Not the desperate happiness of someone trying to convince herself everything was fine, but the quiet contentment of someone who had faced the worst and discovered she was strong enough to survive it. "I am happy," I said, surprised by how easily the words came. For the first time in years, I'm exactly who I want to be. The exhibition ran for 3 months and led to opportunities I'd never expected. A gallery in Sedona offered me a solo show. A publisher expressed interest in turning the portrait series into a book about recovery and renewal. The community college where I'd been teaching as an adjunct instructor offered me a full-time position. Each opportunity represented choices I could make based on my own priorities rather than someone else's needs or expectations. The freedom was intoxicating after years of unconsciously compromising my goals to maintain a relationship that had never existed. 5 years after Derek's arrest, I was featured in a magazine article about women who had transformed traumatic experiences into artistic and professional success. The journalist asked how I'd managed to rebuild so completely after such devastating betrayal. I realized that the woman Derek married was someone I'd been pretending to be, I said. She was accommodating and trusting and willing to set aside her own dreams for someone else's ambitions. Losing her was actually liberating, because it forced me to discover who I really was underneath all those compromises. The article brought letters from women around the country who had survived similar experiences of systematic deception and identity theft. Many were still struggling with trust issues and emotional recovery. Others had rebuilt their lives in ways that honored their authentic selves, rather than trying to recreate what they'd lost. Reading their stories, I understood that Derek's crimes had been both more common and more devastating than I'd realized. He wasn't a unique monster, but rather an extreme example of people who view relationships as opportunities for exploitation rather than connection. But their letters also demonstrated something Derek had never understood about the women he'd targeted. We were stronger than he'd calculated, more resilient than he'd anticipated, and capable of growth he'd never imagined. His attempts to destroy us had instead forced us to discover resources we hadn't known we possessed. 7 years after Derek entered federal prison, I received a notification that he was being released on parole. The letter from Victim Services offered me the opportunity to attend his release hearing and provide input about parole conditions. I declined the opportunity. Derek Porter and David Preston were no longer part of my story except as catalysts for growth I might never have achieved otherwise. Whatever happened to him after release was between him and the parole system. By then, I was living in Sedona, running a photography studio that specialized in portraits and fine art landscapes. The desert that surrounded my new home provided endless inspiration and a sense of space that had been missing from my life during the marriage. Lisa visited regularly, bringing news about her own recovery and the successful marketing consulting business she'd launched after leaving her corporate job. We'd both used Derek's restitution payments to fund transitions that honored our authentic interests rather than maintaining the lives we'd constructed around his deception. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd never found out?" she asked during one visit, as we hiked among the red rocks that made Sedona famous. I considered the question seriously. "I think I would have died slowly," I said finally. "Not physically, but emotionally and spiritually. I was disappearing into someone else's idea of who I should be." The woman who had married Derek Porter had been vanishing long before I discovered his deception. She'd been eroding through years of small compromises and accommodations that seemed reasonable at the time but cumulatively had nearly destroyed my sense of authentic self. Derek's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also been accidentally liberating. It had forced me to confront the difference between love and exploitation, between partnership and performance, between who I thought I should be and who I actually was. Standing on a cliff overlooking the desert valley where I'd chosen to rebuild my life, I felt grateful for the journey that had brought me to this moment. Not grateful for Derek's crimes or the pain they'd caused, but grateful for the strength I'd discovered in surviving them. The sun was setting behind distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have made perfect subjects for the photography students I was mentoring. Tomorrow I would continue building the life I'd chosen rather than the life someone else had designed for me. Derek Porter had been a criminal who had stolen years from my life. But Rachel Porter, the woman who had emerged from that experience, was someone I was proud to be. She was honest about what she needed, clear about what she wouldn't accept, and courageous enough to demand authenticity in all her relationships. The woman who had trusted blindly was gone forever. In her place stood someone who understood that the greatest revenge against those who try to destroy us is simply living well, on our own terms, with integrity they can never touch. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.